All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back for another Octopi Poker study session with myself, Matt Hunt, and Johan Schultz. So welcome, Johan.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. We're going to dive into some more spots today, and we're going to particularly focus on a specific scenario this time. We're going to look at a low jack versus button 40 big blind situation, and we're going to dive into talking about some of the pre-flop ranges and the different post-flop considerations for various types of board textures. So let's dive in.
So we have the low jack's opening range here. Let's click that. Let's now navigate to button, click call, and the two other guys folded. When I'm looking at a spot like this, the first thing I think about is, where are the ranges the most different, and where that's the most important is to look at the offsuit region, because our offsuit hands has 12 combos and suited hands only has 4 combos. And in this case, we see that the low jack has a clear advantage in terms of 10 high offsuit hands. So this is likely going to be very important. Post flop, we'll see that on 10 high boards, low jack is doing better than button.
Makes a lot of sense. I think the approach that we're taking here with looking at the positional formation is something that players tend not to do enough of. I think that there are a lot of players who study in a way where they try to kind of learn how to play a specific board or a specific type of a spot, but they don't really look at the big picture of how are these two ranges interacting before we even get to a flop. Because that in itself is going to help you to predict how certain flops are going to play out and what certain flops are going to look like. If you don't understand the shape of the two pre-flop ranges, it's going to be really hard to accurately interpret anything that you see post-flop. So this is a good starting point, and it's important that we start here. And I think it's useful to show people that this is the appropriate way to kind of begin studying a spot, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Even for a spot I have studied before, I always like to take a look at the pre-flop ranges again. It just makes it much easier to learn and understand the spot. And
it also allows you to start to extrapolate and make changes when you see a player whose range is wider or tighter or something than it's supposed to be, because you can start to say, okay, well, I'm in low jack versus cutoff, but I'm against a player who plays a bit wider than normal. So maybe I'm going to treat this as if it was low jack against button and just play the strategy that I would normally have for a low jack against button spot. That works fairly well for adapting to players who have, unusual ranges, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. So if we go back to just studying the ranges, we see that, almost coincidentally, the width of the two ranges are very similar. We see low jack is playing 24% of hands, and button here is playing roughly 24% of hands. So we see that besides the 10x advantage for low jack, we also see that low jack has an overpay advantage when it goes post flop. Low jack will have jacks, queens, kings, and aces much more often than button. Meanwhile, button will have a couple more hands that play well post flop, such as deuces, trees, and fours. Few extra suited connected hands. Meanwhile, low jack has a few more kind of blocker heavy hands. He tried to take down the pot pre-flop with a hand such as ace 9 or king 10 that just blocks the top of the other player's ranges.
A little bit more high card value in the opening range just because of that extra fold equity that comes from having high cards. But I also like to look at it as the pre-flop raiser knows that the most likely outcome is that they end up playing heads up against the big blind. So part of why they have a lot more high card hands and a lot fewer low card hands is because high card hands are more likely to dominate the big blind more frequently. So they have more board textures that they can get a lot of value with those hands on. Whereas the low card hands, if you look at like deuces, for example, deuces is going to struggle in a lot of spots out of position against the other callers, but it's also going to be in some very awkward spots against the big blind because even though big blind is calling with all the suited deuce X hands, pretty much everything in the big blind's range is just flipping against those low pairs. So you just have less incentive to want to play that pot in position against them compared to with something like king 10 off or ace 9 off.
Yeah, good points.
Another aspect of this that we can kind of focus on just to analyze the differences between these ranges is that with the overall ranges being fairly symmetrical, or with the ranges of hands that are actually putting money in the pot being somewhat similar here, the biggest determinant of how these board textures or how different board textures are going to interact with these ranges is going to be the fact that obviously a lot of these hands in the buttons position are just going to 3-bet. But at the same time, it's not always intuitive how that 3-bet range is going to be constructed, because a lot of players will look at jacks or tens or ace queen suited and say, well, these are really good hands, I'm going to 3-bet them. But in fact, these are not pure 3-bets here because they are a little bit less incentivized to stack off. They have a slightly more difficult decision against 4-bets. And the button also doesn't want to have an excessively capped flatting range. They want to make sure that they do have some reason to give the low jack a bit less ability to just blast off against them post flop. So there is some stuff in there that, even though it's in both ranges at 100% frequency, stuff like jacks, tens, ace queen, that type of range, how often the button is going to 3-bet those compared to flatting those is going to have a big impact here in how this spot is going to play out.
So I think it's a good time to test some of our theories out, such as, how we do well on the 10 high boards by going to the aggregate reports.
Yeah.
And you can just do that by clicking the big aggregate report button on the screen. Now we see the Octopi aggregate reports. To the left, we see the overall frequencies for the low jack. So once low jack has opened and button has called pre-flop, the rest of the player folds. This is going to be the average strategy for the low jack on all 1755 flops. So we see that half the time low jack is going to check, 24% of the time low jack is going for a small bet, 25% pot, and 25% of the time low jack is going for a 66% of the pot bet, so like bigger bet. Over here we have a high card filter. So let's select the 10 and see how the overall frequencies change. There we go. We see when a 10 comes, the low jack is very thrilled about the average board with a 10. So we're going to see less check, we're going to see less small bet, and we're going to see a lot more big bet. So overall, low jack is putting in a lot more money on 10 high boards compared to the average board.
Do you want to dive into explaining a little bit why the desire to put more money into the pot on these boards exists and what sort of factors are driving that?
Yeah, so the main factor is simply that the low jack, as we saw on the pre-flop ranges, has more 10x. They are opening some 10x offsuit hands that the button is simply folding or maybe sometimes 3-betting pre-flop. So when a 10 comes, low jack seizes the opportunity to put in more money. If the low jack does not do this, there's going to be a turn and the board might change to something that favors the button again. So it's a good idea to put in money as soon as the board benefits you. There's no reason to wait.
That makes a lot of sense. Another interesting aspect of what we see here, I think, is the way that you can see a pretty obvious difference here between some of the rainbow boards and some of their two-tone equivalents. So for example, if we look at the 10-10 deuce rainbow is a good example here. On the rainbow board, we've got 10-10 deuce with a 64% big bet frequency. And then on the two-tone version of that board, that big bet starts to disappear quite a bit.
I think it's possible to take a deeper look by looking at the board side by side. But from an overall perspective, generally speaking, in this spot, low jack against button, or just in general in out of position opens against in position flat. Two-tone boards or flush draw boards are going to favor the in-position player. The in-position player is just has more suited hands in their range. So whenever there's a flush draw on the board, the button is just going to have more of them. They're just going to have more equity. Yeah. We can definitely see this when we take a look at the monotone flops. We see there's a lot of check, and when they bet, they're not putting in a lot of money. So yeah, that's the first thing.
Yeah, and I think also I like to sort of look at these spots by thinking about what are the indifferent regions for the player that's facing the bet, right? Because on a two-tone board, you've got a front door flush draw that's not going to be indifferent against basically any size because it's not going to fold. And then you've got one backdoor flush draw that maybe is going to call a lot of the time against most sizes, but fold if the size is really big. And you've got two combos or two suited versions of a hand that flop no backdoor at all. But on a rainbow board, you don't have that front door flush draw. So you don't have that region of hand that is not indifferent against any size. And now you have three different backdoors that are all going to have a trivial call against a small bet, but they're actually going to be a bit closer to indifferent against a larger bet. And I think obviously it's hard to really prove one way or the other, but I would definitely think it's reasonable to assume that that's having an effect on the sizings here as well, especially when you consider that on a monotone board, when there's no backdoors at all, we don't see any big betting whatsoever. Right. I think the number of available backdoors starts to make an impact here.
Yeah. When we bet, often we want to make life tough for our opponent. And a hand like, let's say, queen, jack with a backdoor flush draw, when you're in position and you face, say, a 25% c-bet, you have a very clear call. You have overcards to a lot of low jacks pocket pairs. You have a backdoor flush draw. You have a backdoor straight draw. You have a lot of things going on for your hand. So you have an easy call against a small bet. But if your opponent bets big, all of a sudden it's not as fun to continue anymore. As Matt said, on 10-10-2 two-tone, there are not as many of these hand classes in button's range. Queen jack of hearts, you no longer have the flush draw. So all of a sudden, it's pretty tough to continue even against a small bet. Another thing I think has an impact on why we bet small on a board like this compared to rainbow version is the future aspects of some of our value bets. If we have a hand like, let's say, pocket nines, it's much more of a clear value bet for a 66% size when the board is rainbow compared to when it's two-tone. Like the board has many more opportunities to change, and we might end up regretting having put in that big bet on the flop on more turn cards.
Right. You're less likely to have to slow down on the turn when the flop is rainbow. And in fact, you're quite often going to have situations where if the turn does bring a backdoor, you actually get to bet big again because there's that ability to put that backdoor draw an indifferent spot. You can get a second street of value there. You can also create some indifference. Whereas on those two-tone boards, you're obviously going to have a lot of turn cards where the flush just gets there, and now you have to slow down quite a lot. And I think people are very inclined to look at two-tone boards as like, oh, I want to put more money in because I want to get value from the draws. But I don't think that getting value from draws is as important as people think it is, because a lot of the time those draws are pretty high equity against a lot of your value bet range. And you're not really like every dollar your opponent puts into the pot with a draw, they're recouping a lot of that money back. But every dollar they put into the pot with a bluff catcher that's drawing dead against your value, that's the stuff that really matters a lot to your EV. So I tend to look at it as the draws are actually much less important than a lot of the made hands,
Yeah, I definitely agree. It does feel like a lot of people get tunnel vision on flush draws and how flush draws impact the overall strategy of a given flop. Meanwhile, as you mentioned, the flush draws are not as relevant because, as you mentioned, they're going to recoup that EV by often making a flush, and all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, thank you for making the pot big.
Yeah, exactly. I hear a lot, like you'll be analyzing a hand with somebody and you'll look at a flop and be like, okay, talk me through what the opposing range looks like. And for some reason they just go, if the flop is two-tone, they just jump straight to flush draws. They're like, well, they could have a flush draw. And it's like, okay, sure. Yeah. That's like 7% of his range. Now what's the rest of it? Like people really are very focused on flush draws.
Good point. Now it's a good time to take a look at these two specific boards more in depth. We have 10-10 deuce rainbow in this window, and we have 10-10 deuce two-tone in the other window. We see that the strategy on both boards, they are betting often, but again, the difference in bet sizing is pretty extreme. To better understand this, let's take a look at what type of hands are indifferent against, let's say, the big bet here in 10-10 deuce rainbow. So what do we see here, Matt?
Well, I think the thing that jumps out at me the most here is that there's obviously a few hands that are trivial folds, but even a lot of the ace high hands here on this board texture are continuing. And that's because there's 3 different backdoors here that are available. Even if we have, ace 7 with a backdoor flush draw, and even if we face that 2/3 pot bet, there's a lot of incentive for the in position player to sometimes continue there. And this is partly why we see this large bet coming in here. It's because there's 3 available backdoors that would have trivial continues against a small bet. And the large bet is the only type of bet size that can actually start to put those hands in a bit more of a tough spot.
Good point. And we can go check how the strategy looks against a small bet, just for comparison. And before I do that, it needs to be said that this small bet here on this board that happens 8% of the time, I would just ignore that. Like in game, I would play a big bet or check strategy. And I don't know what to call it exactly, but I would say this small bet is biased in a way. It's a very specific range. It's weighted towards hands that don't really care about getting folds. So that would be a hand like Watts. you don't really care
Mhm.
whether or not you get a fold here. It would be a hand like ace jack, ace 10, ace queen that, that do not mind button floating with weaker dominated ace highs. What you might see here, like you see a range that continues 92% of the time. And I dare say that if we node locked or force the strategy of the low jack player to only bet small, you would probably see button continue even more than 98% of the time here.
Yeah, probably. I think a really good way to approach when you see spots like this in Sims is if you see a strategy and there's no specific hand or specific region of hands within that range that actually heavily favors using that bet size. Like if it's just a bet size that's used at low frequencies by kind of a little bits and pieces of various different hands, but there's no specific region of hands that's like, this is the best bet size, then you don't need to have that in your strategy. And in this particular spot, we see that there was no hand that was even betting the small size more than half the time. And even quad tens was mostly checking. So I think it's a pretty clear example of a situation where it just isn't necessary to have that be 25 in your strategy, because it's built mostly around quads and a couple of those other hands that you mentioned. And even they don't really care that much about using that size.
Yeah, good point. So unless you see a hand like really, really favoring specific bet 25 size here, you can just simply ignore that size. So yeah, if we take a look at button's response against the small quarter pot bet, we see that almost no hands here are indifferent. You get a hand like 6-5 of spades to fold, which is not exciting. Even ace-3 of spades can continue sometimes. So clearly this bigger bet is much more effective. Pocket eights, it's strong enough to bet for value for this size. Same goes for a hand like jacks. Yeah, you can even bet ace king for this size. It kind of acts like a value bet.
And let's talk a little bit, shall we, about why a paired board like this plays differently in this kind of formation to how it would do in a formation where we're up against the big blind.
So a lot of people have caught on that if you say open the low jack and big blind defends and the board comes 10-10 deuce, that you should be going for a strategy where you only bet small. And when you play against the big blind has a much wider range than what you see here. So there are many more hands you can target with the small size. Meanwhile, the big blind also has more just offsuit 10x. So their range is gonna include more knotted hands, and it's going to include more junk. And you don't need to bet big to get junk to fold, and you don't want to bet big into the nuts. So naturally, if you're low jack against big blind, it makes sense to bet small. In this case, button does not have as much junk as
big blind.
Yeah, as big blind. It's easier to continue jack 9 when you're in position compared to when you're out of position. So you do need to size up to apply more pressure to your opponent's range.
And I think this is a common thing that players get wrong when they look at a certain board and they think that, oh, this board is a small bet board, and they just apply that in a universal way, when in fact, there's a lot of instances where a board can become, it can be a small bet board in one formation, but a big bet board in another, or it can be, a small bet board in a single raise pot, but a big bet board in a 3-bet pot, and so on,
Yeah. If we now go take a look at this 10-10 deuce board, here we see that, as we've already pointed out, the main size or the only size is this small bet. So let's see what happens when we bet small, because as we remember, when we bet small on the rainbow version, we saw almost no folds. But let's take a look now. We see a couple more folds, this time 11%, but this time there are just a couple more hands that are weak against the small bet, such as Queen 9 of hearts, Queen 9 of spades. They do not have a backdoor flush draw. And then, I wanna get into like how it's a little bit more advanced, right? Where on the turn, something people don't seem to understand a lot in poker is how you need to think ahead when you're playing.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like so many people are just thinking about the current street. Yeah, they look at the hand, they maybe even look at their range, and they think, I'm gonna bet this because on this board, I can target these hands and so on. But people don't they don't realize that it's a 3-street game, and you gotta think ahead. And different hands, they want, by the end of the hand, they want to put in, specific amounts of chips, right? And when the board is two-tone, there are more runouts where the board changes to something where you don't want a lot of chips to have gone in. So it just makes sense to navigate slower from the beginning. And then if the light is green and the board didn't change, now you go for a big bet on the river. Now you're like, okay, the coast is clear. I can go for a big bet.
Yeah, exactly. And it's always hard to strike that balance of, I don't want to try to predict what my opponent is going to do on the turn and river. I just want to focus on what are the runouts that can exist on turns and river, because I think players get really caught up in like, well, I don't want to call the turn because what happens if they bet the river? It's not about that. It's about, if I call the turn, what are the options that I'm going to have on the river? What are the river cards that are going to interact with this hand or this range and so on? So it's the same here. It's not about, well, I want to, I'm going to assume that like my opponent's going to bet the turn if the flush card comes or something. Don't have to assume what they're going to do. You just have to recognize that when the flush card comes, it's going to alter the makeup of the ranges, and you have to account for that.
I think I might have a good way of showing everyone watching why we would want to bet big on this board while we bet small on this board. So let's follow a hand. Let's say we have pocket eights and we go for a big bet on the flop. Clearly, pocket eights is a value bet. We can go check the equity. It has 69% equity depending on the exact suits, and 69% good enough to put in this bet. It has a lot of things it accomplishes. It gets more money from the underpairs before the board changes to something with an overcard where you won't be able to get a value bet in against a hand like pocket fours. And it also clears out some equity against pocket eights, a hand like king jack or king queen with something like 26 or 25% equity. They mostly fold against this bet. We have established that you have enough equity to consider this a value bet, and B, you accomplish something by putting in a value bet on this street. So if they click call and we go to the turn, now we're not gonna, I have to click a turn here to get to the next line, but I want to navigate to show runouts to see the EV of pocket eights on different boards. I'm gonna pretend we have, let's say, 8 of hearts, 8 of spades. Now, when I plug that in, I see the strategy of eights on all the different. And I also, if I go here, sort by EV, I also see the EV of the different turns. So the best turn card for pocket eights is going to be, unsurprisingly, another 8. The second best thing is going to be a 10. And the reason being, now it is half as likely that they have trips, which is one of the few hands that beats pocket eights, besides a few overpairs. And then eights, also likes completely blank cards that do not create a flush draw. On the very opposite end, we see an ace. That's the worst card. Now eights is only worth 3.5 chips. That's the small number up here. Meanwhile, pocket eights is worth 30 chips or 30 big blinds. And naturally, the ace is the worst card because the ace is the card, button is the most likely to float. Now I want to compare this to the two-tone version. So let's say that eights gets fancy and decides to go for this big bet. Click big, we click call, and now we take a turn just so we can navigate to the show runouts, which what are the suits? 8 of hearts.
Spades and hearts. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. The specific EVs are not, like, we're not going to compare every single EV, but what I think is important is we're going to look here. It says 30, 30, 20, 20. These are like the super knotted ones, but then it's like 12, 11, 11, 11, 10, 10, 10, 9, 9, 9. 8, 8, like 8, 7, 7, like lots of these. Eights is doing pretty fine on a lot of turns. Meanwhile here, it's, of course, there are a few knotted full house turns, but then there's a lot of 10, 10, 10, 9, 9, 9. So a few cards that are the same, but then there are a lot of like 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 3, 3, 3, 3. Meanwhile, over here, there are not as many of these. There are, of course, some 3, 3, 3, but there are way more 6, 6, 6, 7, 7, 7.
Right.
So what I'm trying to get at with this long rant is that there are just more turn cards where pocket eights regretted having put in a big bet on the flop. It's going to put itself in tough situations by betting big on the flop when the flop is two-toned. And you can apply this to a lot of other hands. Jacks, even a hand like jacks, which is objectively a stronger hand than pocket eights, also has trouble on certain turn cards. But the whole range and also the value bets, it would rather start out slow, see what happens, and then by the river, if the run out comes out clean, then we can decide to put in the amount of money we want. I think that's my long explanation.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at things. In particular, you could see with just looking at the worst possible scenario in each of those cases. You know, you saw that the worst case scenario on the rainbow flop was, I think the worst turn was an ace, which was like 3.4.
Yeah.
And then on the two tone, the worst possible turn was something like 2.2. You know, so you can definitely see if you look at just even in the worst case scenario, you've got some boards here that are below 3 big blinds in EV, some turn cards. So that's probably the best sort of simplified representation of that, is that on the rainbow board, we're guaranteed an EV on the turn of like at least 3 big blinds, but in this spot, it's just we're not guaranteed. You know, there are some really bad turns that cause us to just have to shut down completely, especially when we don't have a diamond in our hand.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. Like on, let's say, the ace of diamond turn, which is the worst card in the deck for pocket eights, we are only winning 2.2 big blinds. And, you know, we have 2 pair, right? Like we have 8s and 10s. And the pot is 16.5 big blinds. But somehow we only capture 2 of those big blinds. You know, that's pretty bad.
Yeah.
If we look at, let's say, the equity, you can find sort by. So pocket eight, it has 36% equity, which, you know, if we had 100% equity realization, we would open up the calculator, we'd multiply this. We should, in theory, or not in theory, we should capture around 6 big blinds in EV with 8s based on our equity. But because it's so hard to navigate a hand like 8s on this turn out of position, we only end up capturing 2 of these big blinds. So if you guys are familiar with the term equity realization, I think 8s realize around 33% of its equity, which is horrible. So we do not want to play a line where we end in a horrible spot like this.
Absolutely. So I think we got to a good point there to call it a wrap for this episode, but we're going to go into another video shortly, and we're going to look at doing some of these spots in the trainer, talk through some of the different dynamics, and see if we can avoid making any big blunders in the trainer now that we've gone through and figured out what our strategy is going to look like here. So stick with us, and we'll be back in another video where we'll go through some of that stuff.
All right. Perfect. See you there, guys.